They told me she was already dead. That is the part I remember most clearly from that day in the war room. 400 species, 1,000 flag officers, and every single one of them had already decided that Queen Salith was gone. I stood at the back of the chamber, the only human in a sea of alien commanders, and I listened to them explain in calm, measured tones why they would not be going after her. The Korvathi delegation went first. They always did. The insectoids loved their numbers, and the numbers they put on the display wall were brutal. 0.03%. That was the survival probability for any ship attempting to enter the Ashenmaw Nebula and reach the coordinates where the Queen had last transmitted. Not 3%, not 0.3%. 0.03. One chance in more than 3,000. The Drenari delegate spoke next. 8 feet tall, covered in plates of natural armor, and built like something that could walk through a wall without slowing down. He called the proposed rescue mission mathematical suicide. He said the word slowly, letting his translator render it in 6 languages at once. Then he sat down and folded his enormous arms and stared at the table as though the matter was settled. It nearly was. The Thessari ambassador stood last. She was beautiful in the way that all Thessari were beautiful, like a heron made of silver and light, and when she spoke, her voice carried the formal cadence of a species that had been practicing diplomacy since before humans had discovered fire. She expressed her deepest grief. She honored the Queen's legacy, and then she said the words that made my blood go cold. She formally declared Queen Salith Aeon lost beyond retrieval. I felt my hands close into fists at my sides. Nobody looked at me. I was Commander Dominic Voss, Human Special Operations, attached to the Galactic Union's Joint Security Division, and in that room full of admirals and ambassadors and species that had been traveling between stars for millennia, I was furniture. A courtesy appointment. The humans had been part of the Union for less than 40 years, and most of the older species still treated us like children who had wandered into a boardroom. But I knew things they were choosing to forget. I knew that Queen Salith was not just a figurehead. Her biology was the foundation of the entire Union's peace. The Velenthari, her species, produced a pheromone signature so complex that it took alien scientists 3 centuries just to begin mapping it. That signature was woven into the Accord Resonance, the biological peace treaty that kept 400 species from ripping each other apart. Every 30 cycles, the Queen renewed the resonance. Without her, the chemical bonds that suppressed interspecies aggression would begin to decay. Old hatreds would resurface, ancient wars would reignite, and the clock had already started. 11 days. That was what we had before the resonance failed and the galaxy began tearing itself apart. I stepped forward. The movement drew a few glances, mostly curious, a few irritated. The Thessari ambassador tilted her head at me, with the kind of patient expression you give a child who has raised their hand at the wrong time. I told them I had a plan. The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something so unexpected that the room needs a moment to process whether it was a joke. I kept talking. The Ashenmaw was a collapsing nebula, threaded with gravitational shear zones that shifted constantly. No navigational computer could map it in real time, because the physics inside were too chaotic, too fast-changing. Every simulation crashed. Every algorithm failed. That was why the Yarathi Dominion had taken the Queen there. They knew no one would follow. But I was not proposing to send a computer. I was proposing to send a human pilot flying manual. The Korvathi delegate made a sound like 2 rocks grinding together, which was how his species expressed disbelief. He told me that no biological organism could process spatial data fast enough to navigate gravitational shear zones in real time. I told him he had never watched a human pilot fly. The murmur that went through the chamber was not encouraging. I could hear translators struggling to render the concept for species that had never encountered it. Manual navigation through a gravitational shear zone. It sounded like suggesting someone swim through a hurricane by feeling the current. But I had data of my own. 3 years of operational reports from human deep space missions that had survived conditions no automated system could handle. The Kareth anomaly, where Lieutenant Petra Hale had flown a shuttle through a radiation storm by watching the color shifts in the hull plating and adjusting course based on how the metal sang. The Verdant Reach incident, where a human freighter crew had navigated a micrometeorite field for 11 hours on manual controls because their nav computer had taken a hit in the first 30 seconds. Humans did not just survive chaos. We performed in it. He was right about the math. On paper, it was impossible. But humans did not fly on paper. We flew on instinct, on muscle memory, on that strange and violent gift that evolution had given us. The ability to make split-second decisions in chaos, and be right just often enough to survive. Our brains had been shaped by millions of years of dodging predators, throwing rocks at moving targets, and crossing rivers that were trying to drown us. We were not precise, we were not elegant, but we were very, very hard to kill. The Union Chancellor rose from his seat. He was a Morvathi, tall and thin and ancient, and his word was law in this chamber. He looked at me with an expression that I had come to recognize from dozens of alien species. It was the look they gave humans when we said something that sounded like either brilliance or madness, and they could not tell which. He formally refused to authorize the mission. He labeled any attempt reckless endangerment of Union assets. Then he dismissed the assembly. I stood there and watched 400 species worth of military leadership file out of the room, already talking about contingency plans and emergency protocols and how to manage the political collapse that would follow the Queen's death. Not one of them talked about saving her. I walked out of the chamber and found a quiet corridor and pulled up my comm unit. I scrolled through my contact list, past the official channels and the Union frequencies, down to a private group that had no name. Just 5 contacts. 5 people I had served with, bled with, nearly died with more times than I could count. I sent a single message. I told them what had happened. I told them where the Queen was. I told them the survival odds. And I told them I was going anyway. The responses came back within minutes. Kaya Osei answered first. She was the best pilot I had ever seen, and I had seen a lot of pilots. She did not ask about the odds. She did not ask about authorization. She sent 3 words: send me coordinates. Cole Erickson responded next, from a refueling station on the far side of the Drenari sector. He was a weapons specialist who could turn a broken toaster into something dangerous, and his message was even shorter. On my way. Priya Nolan pinged from a medical frigate where she had been serving as a field surgeon. She asked one question: how many wounded should I plan for? I told her to plan for all of us. She sent back a single word: understood. Leo Garza was the last to respond. Combat engineer, problem solver, the kind of man who could fix a reactor with a wrench and a prayer. His message arrived 40 minutes after the others, and I could tell from the transmission tags that he had already changed course before he sent it. He wrote, "You know you are insane, right?" Then, right below it, "See you at the dock." I stood in that corridor and read their messages one more time. No arguments, no hesitation, no calculations about probability or career consequences, or what the Union would do to us for running an unauthorized mission into hostile space. Just 5 humans who heard that someone needed help and decided that was reason enough. I deleted the messages, locked my comm unit, and started walking toward the docks. Behind me, the war room was already being converted for the next crisis meeting. The galaxy was preparing for the Queen to die. I was not. The salvage dock at Corin Station smelled like engine coolant and rust, and the ship sitting in Bay 14 looked like it had been through a war. It had. The Jericho Fall was a Horizon-class human frigate that had been decommissioned after the Sethrak border incident 3 years ago. She had taken a plasma lance through her midsection, lost half her sensor array, and been towed back to port with her crew alive, only because Leo had held the hull together with emergency sealant and sheer stubbornness. She was ugly. Her armor plating was scarred and mismatched where field repairs had been done with whatever materials were available. Her portside thruster housing was slightly crooked. The name painted on her bow was faded and chipped. But her engines were solid, her reactor was hot, and she was fast. That was what mattered. Kaya was already on board when I arrived. I found her in the cockpit with her boots up on the console, running through pre-flight checks with the casual efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She looked up when I came through the hatch and gave me a grin that was half welcome and half accusation. She told me I looked terrible. I told her the ship looked worse. She laughed and said they deserved each other. Cole arrived 2 hours later, carrying a duffel bag that clanked with the sound of things that were probably not standard issue. He dumped it in the cargo hold, surveyed the ship with the critical eye of a man who knew exactly how many ways a spacecraft could fail, and then started pulling panels off the weapons systems without being asked. Priya came next, quiet and focused, already wearing her field kit. She converted the aft storage compartment into a medical bay in under an hour, working with the kind of precision that came from years of patching people together under fire. She did not ask questions. She organized supplies, ran diagnostics on the med systems, and prepared for the worst. Leo was the last to board. He came through the airlock with grease on his hands and a grin on his face, and the first thing he did was drop to his knees next to the main power conduit and press his ear against the hull like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. He stood up and announced that she would hold. Probably. That was the crew. 5 humans, 1 battered ship, and no authorization to do what we were about to do. I gathered them in the Jericho Falls cramped mess hall, which was really just a table bolted to the deck between the galley unit and the weapons locker. I laid out everything I knew: the Queen's location, the Ashen Maw's characteristics, the Urathi Dominion's military capabilities, the 11-day countdown before the Accord resonance collapsed and the galaxy started ripping itself apart. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked if we could wait for authorization or support. Kaya studied the nebula data with her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed, already mapping flight paths in her head. Cole counted ammunition and calculated ordnance requirements. Priya made lists of medical supplies she would need for injuries she was already anticipating. Leo pulled up engineering schematics of the Jericho Fall and started identifying every system that might fail and what he could do about it. These were people who had trained their entire careers for moments like this. Not the glory of it, not the heroism, the competence, the ability to look at a problem that had no good solution and find the least bad one and execute it with precision. We were not alone for long. While Cole was rewiring the torpedo launchers, the airlock chimed and a figure stepped through that none of us expected. She was Thesari, young by their standards, with feathers that shifted between silver and pale blue when the light caught them. She moved with the nervous energy of someone who had made a decision and was still catching up to the consequences of it. Her name was Vyeth, and she was an intelligence officer assigned to the Thesari delegation. She told us that she had voted against the Council's decision to abandon the Queen. Not that her vote counted for much, she added, since she was the most junior officer in the entire delegation. But she had done something that did count. She had smuggled out the Queen's last transponder signal data, along with everything the Thesari Intelligence Service had collected on the Urathi Dominion's movements in the Ashen Maw sector. I asked her why. She looked at me with those large amber eyes that the Thesari had, and she told me the truth. She said she could not fly a ship, she could not fire a weapon, she could not patch a hull or treat a wound. But she knew the Urathi's communication protocols better than anyone alive, and if we were going to fly into their territory, we would need someone who could listen to their signals and tell us what they were saying. I looked at my crew. Kaya shrugged. Cole nodded. Leo gave a thumbs up. Priya simply made room in the medical bay. I told Vyeth she was in. We were prepping the final launch sequence when one more visitor arrived, and this one did not come aboard. A Korvathi stood at the base of the docking ramp, tall and angular, and clicking softly in the way that their species did when they were processing something that did not fit their models. I recognized him from the war room. He had been the one who delivered the survival probability. He held out a data chip. I took it. He told me that the chip contained everything the Korvathi Analytical Core had calculated about the Ashen Maw's internal structure, the shifting gravity corridors, the shear zones, the tidal patterns. He said that with this data, the Jericho Falls computers would be able to provide partial navigational support for approximately 19% of the journey. Manual flight would be required for the remaining 81%. Then he said something that I will never forget. He told me that our survival probability was now 0.07%. He had doubled our chances. And he called it the most illogical thing he had ever done. I thanked him. He stared at me for a long moment. then turned and walked away without another word. We launched 17 minutes later. Union patrol ships tracked us as we burned toward the Ashen Maw, and I waited for the order to stand down, for tractor beams or warning shots or some admiral demanding we return to dock. Nothing came. The patrol ships watched us go. I think they believed we were already dead. The Ashen Maw filled the viewport like a wound in space. It was not like other nebulae, not a gentle cloud of color and light. It was dark, churning, shot through with veins of energy that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. The gravitational readings were off every scale we had. Inside that cloud, space itself was broken, twisted into corridors and dead ends that shifted and collapsed without warning. Kaya studied it for exactly 4 seconds, then she reached over and switched off the navigational computer. Vyeth made a sound from the back that I think was a gasp. In the Thesari language, it might have been a prayer. Kaya rolled her shoulders, placed her hands on the manual controls, and took us in. What happened next is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. The moment we crossed the boundary, every sensor on the ship screamed. The gravitational forces hit us from 6 directions at once. The hull groaned. The lights flickered. The ship lurched sideways so hard that I slammed into my harness and tasted blood. And Kaya flew. She did not think. I watched her from the co-pilot seat, and I could see it in her eyes. She was not calculating trajectories or processing data or running simulations in her head. She was feeling the ship. Every vibration, every shift in the deck plating, every subtle change in the pitch of the engines. She read the Ashen Maw the way a surfer reads a wave, with her body, with instinct, with something that had no name but that every human recognized. The gravitational corridors tried to crush us. She slipped through gaps that closed a half-second after we passed. Shear zones reached for the hull like invisible hands, and she twisted away with moves that would have made a computer lock up trying to calculate the physics. Twice she inverted the ship completely, using the gravity wells to slingshot us through passages that should not have existed. At one point, a corridor collapsed directly ahead of us. I saw it on the partial sensor display, a wall of gravitational force slamming shut like a door. We were 3 seconds from hitting it. Kaya did not flinch. She cut the main engine, fired the port thrusters at maximum, and spun the Jericho Fall 90 degrees in a move that pulled 6 Gs and made my vision go gray at the edges. We slid through a gap between 2 converging shear planes that was barely wider than the ship itself, and I heard the hull plating scrape against something that should not have been solid but felt like it was. Cole's voice came from the weapons bay, strained and breathless. He asked if Kaya was trying to fly the ship or destroy it. She did not answer. She was already lining up the next maneuver. The Korvathi data helped. When the corridors aligned with the predictions, the computer could take over for brief stretches, giving Kaya seconds to rest her hands and breathe. But most of the time, she flew blind, relying on nothing but human reflexes and the sound of the ship around her. Vyeth sat in the back with her feathers pressed flat against her skull, which was the Thesari equivalent of pure terror. She stared at Kaya with an expression that I had seen many times on alien faces. It was the expression they wore when they watched humans do something that every rational calculation said was impossible. 43 minutes. That was how long the transit took. It felt like a lifetime. When we broke through the inner boundary and the gravitational forces dropped to something merely dangerous instead of lethal, every system on the ship was redlined, and there was smoke in the cockpit, and Kaya's hands were shaking. But we were through. The sensors cleared enough to give us a picture, and what we saw made my stomach drop. Deep inside the Ashen Maw, anchored to a fragment of a dead star's core, sat a massive structure. It was Yarathi, angular and brutal, a fortress station bristling with weapon platforms and sensor arrays. And surrounding it, arranged in a defensive formation that covered every approach vector, was a fleet. I counted 18 warships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, fighter escorts. More firepower than the Jericho Fall could handle in her best days, and these were not her best days. Cole leaned forward and looked at the display. He said what we were all thinking. He asked how we were supposed to get past that. I looked at the debris field that surrounded the fortress, the chunks of rock and dead metal, and stellar wreckage that the Ashen Maw's gravity had pulled into a slow orbit around the station, and I started to smile. The plan was simple, which meant it was either brilliant or suicidal, and I had stopped trying to tell the difference years ago. The debris field around the Arathi fortress was massive. Chunks of rock the size of buildings tumbled through space in a slow, grinding dance, pulled by the gravity of the dead star fragment that the station was anchored to. The Arathi used the field as a natural defense barrier, but it was also their blind spot. Their sensors were calibrated to filter out the constant noise of the debris. If we could make the Jericho Fall look like just another piece of wreckage, we could drift right through their perimeter. Cole and Leo went to work. They shut down every active system they could, reducing our energy signature to almost nothing. Cole rigged the hull plating to scatter sensor returns the same way dense rock would. Leo adjusted our thruster output to match the tumbling pattern of the debris around us, giving us just enough control to steer without looking like we were steering. It was delicate, dangerous work. One spike in our power output, one thruster firing at the wrong moment, and the Arathi fleet would light us up before we could even think about running. Kaya guided us into the debris field with the engines at barely a whisper, matching the drift of a boulder twice our size and tucking the Jericho Fall into its shadow. We moved with the field, slowly, silently, like a predator hiding in tall grass. The tension was different from the Ashen Maw transit. That had been violent, immediate, a fight against physics. This was slow and grinding, the kind of tension that eats at you because there is nothing to do but wait and hope. Every minute that passed without a Arathi challenge was a small victory, and every flicker on the sensor display was a potential death sentence. I watched the Arathi fleet through the viewport. Their ships moved in precise patterns, disciplined formations that spoke of rigid training and absolute obedience to doctrine. They were impressive. They were also predictable. Their patrol routes repeated on cycles that Vyeth clocked at 18 minutes, and the gaps between coverage zones were consistent enough that Kaya could plan our drift to exploit them. Vyeth monitored the Arathi communications throughout. She sat hunched over her station with a translator unit pressed to her ear, her feathers rippling with concentration as she parsed the alien signals. The Arathi used a layered encryption system that would have taken Union intelligence months to crack, but Vyeth had been studying their protocols for years. She could not read everything, but she could read enough. 20 minutes into our drift, she looked up and told me something that changed everything. The Arathi had not taken the Queen for ransom. They were not holding her for political leverage or territorial concessions. They had brought her here because of what she was. The Queen's pheromone biology, the same mechanism that maintained the Union's peace accords, was being studied in the station's bio-research wing. The Arathi scientists were trying to reverse engineer her pheromone signature, to crack the biochemistry that held 400 species in harmony. Their goal was not to destroy the accords. It was worse. They wanted to create a synthetic version of the Queen's pheromones, one they could control. Instead of suppressing aggression and maintaining peace, their version would enforce compliance, obedience. They wanted to turn the galaxy's peace mechanism into a weapon, a chemical leash that would make every species in the Union docile and controllable under Arathi command. The silence on the bridge lasted about 3 seconds. Then Cole said a word that I will not repeat, but that perfectly captured what all of us were feeling. The stakes had not just doubled, they had become existential. If the Arathi succeeded, the galaxy would not collapse into war. It would collapse into slavery, and the Queen would be kept alive, drained slowly, her biology harvested piece by piece for as long as the Arathi needed her. I made a decision then that I did not share with the crew. If we could not get the Queen out, I would make sure the Arathi could not use her either. I hated myself for thinking it, but I thought it anyway. That is what command does to you. We drifted for another hour before the station came close enough for a visual. It was larger than our sensors had suggested, a sprawling complex of interconnected modules built around the star fragment, like a metal spider clinging to a coal. I could see the docking bays, the weapon emplacements, the armored shutters over the viewports. The Arathi built their structures the way they fought, heavy, direct, and brutal. But they had not built for infiltrators. Their security was focused outward, on the nebula and the fleet perimeter. Why would they worry about someone getting inside? No one had ever made it through the Ashen Maw. No one had ever been crazy enough to try. Until now. I briefed the team while Kaya held our position in the debris field, tucked behind a slowly rotating chunk of nickel iron the size of a small building. The insertion point was a waste disposal port on the station's lower hull. It was designed for jettisoning processed material into the debris field, not for receiving visitors, but Leo was confident he could override the cycling mechanism from outside. Once we were in, we would move through the station's industrial sections, the maintenance corridors, and utility passages that ran beneath the main decks, like veins beneath skin. Our target was the bio-research wing, located 3 levels above the station's core. Kaya would stay with the ship. We needed her ready to launch the moment we had the Queen, and the Jericho Fall was useless without a pilot. She did not like it, and she made sure I knew she did not like it, but she understood. The rest of us suited up. Leo loaded his kit with bypass tools and cutting equipment. Cole packed enough ordnance to start a small war, which was appropriate because that was exactly what we might end up doing. Priya carried her medical supplies and a sidearm she had never once fired at anything that was not a target range. Vyeth carried nothing but her comm equipment, and a look on her face that was equal parts determination and terror. I pulled my sidearm, checked the charge, and holstered it. Then I looked at my crew, 4 humans and 1 frightened Thessari intelligence officer, standing in the airlock of a decommissioned frigate, deep inside a collapsing nebula, surrounded by an enemy war fleet. I told them it was a good day for something reckless. The transit from the ship to the station was the longest 6 minutes of my life. We crossed in EVA suits, using the debris field as cover, firing microbursts from our maneuvering packs, only when we were hidden behind tumbling rocks. The station loomed above us, enormous and dark, and I could feel the hum of its reactor through the vibrations in my suit, even before we made contact with the hull. Space around the station was not quiet. Chunks of rock and metal drifted past in slow arcs, casting shadows that moved across the station's hull like dark fingers. Every few seconds, a larger piece of debris would catch a gravitational eddy and accelerate, spinning past us close enough that I could see the mineral veins in the rock. One wrong move, one thruster firing a second too late, and we would be nothing but another piece of wreckage in the field. Vyeth struggled with the EVA. The Thessari were not built for zero-gravity maneuvering. Their hollow bones and lightweight frames made them excellent at many things, but controlling momentum in vacuum was not one of them. Priya stayed close to her, guiding her between cover points, steadying her when the maneuvering pack overcompensated. Leo reached the waste port first. He clamped onto the hull, pulled open the maintenance panel beside the port's exterior housing, and went to work. The Urathi used electromagnetic cycling locks, heavy-duty systems designed for industrial use, not sophisticated enough to resist someone who understood the underlying engineering. Leo did not just understand it, he spoke its language. His hands moved with practiced certainty, rerouting power, bypassing safeties, convincing the lock that it was receiving a legitimate cycling command from the station's automated waste management system. The port opened. We slipped inside, one at a time, dropping into a processing chamber that smelled like burned metal and chemical residue. Leo sealed the port behind us and wiped the entry log from the local system. To the station's computers, the port had never opened. The maintenance corridors were exactly what I had hoped for. Dark, narrow, lined with conduit pipes and cable runs, and completely unmonitored. The Urathi did not waste surveillance resources on utility passages. Their security doctrine was perimeter-focused. Stop the enemy from getting in, and you do not need to worry about what happens inside. It was a sound strategy against conventional threats, but we were not conventional. The air inside the station tasted metallic and warm, recycled through systems that were designed for Urathi biology, not ours. The gravity was slightly heavier than standard, which made sense for a species built like walking tanks. After 30 minutes of moving through the corridors, my legs burned and my shoulders ached from the extra weight. We communicated in hand signals, no comms, no whispers, nothing that could be picked up by an internal sensor we had not detected. Kaya's voice occasionally crackled in my earpiece from the ship, giving us updates on the Urathi fleet's movements outside the station, but we kept our responses to single clicks on the comm channel. 1 click for acknowledged, 2 clicks for hold position, 3 clicks for trouble. We moved quickly. Vyeth guided us using the station's layout data she had pieced together from intercepted communications, pointing out junctions and intersections, warning us when we were near populated sections. She was scared. I could see it in the way her feathers trembled and in the rapid pulse visible in her throat. But she did not stop. She did not hesitate. She pressed her fear down and kept working, and I respected her for it more than I could say. The first Urathi soldiers we encountered were a patrol of 3, moving through a corridor intersection 2 levels below the research wing. They were big, half a head taller than me, covered in thick chitinous plates that served as natural armor. They carried pulse rifles that looked like they had been designed to put holes through walls. We did not fight them. We went around. Leo found a service shaft that bypassed the intersection entirely, and we climbed it in silence, moving past the patrol without being detected. Speed and stealth were our only advantages. The moment we lost either one, this mission was over. The second encounter was closer. We were moving through a ventilation nexus when a maintenance crew appeared at the far end of the passage, 2 Urathi technicians running diagnostics on an atmospheric processor. Cole froze. I froze. The entire team pressed against the walls and held their breath. Priya's hand found Vyeth's arm in the darkness. The Thesari was shaking badly, and I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow. Priya squeezed her arm once, firm and steady, and held on. The shaking slowed, not stopped, but slowed enough. The technicians finished their work and moved on. We waited 60 seconds, then continued. The bio-research wing was behind a security partition on the 3rd level. The partition was a reinforced bulkhead with a biometric lock keyed to Urathi genetic signatures. Leo studied it for 10 seconds, then pulled out a cutting torch and a piece of equipment that I think he had built himself. Cole stood guard behind us, his weapon trained on the corridor we had come through, listening for movement. Priya kept one eye on Vyeth and one eye on the passages ahead. I watched Leo work and tried not to count the seconds. It took him 4 minutes. He did not crack the biometric lock. He bypassed the entire door mechanism, rerouting the power supply through a junction box he had exposed, and feeding it a signal that told the bulkhead's actuators to open. The bulkhead slid back with a hiss, and the bio-research wing stretched out before us. It was clinical, cold, white surfaces and sharp lighting, and the hum of equipment designed to do precise and terrible things. The Urathi researchers had set up rows of analysis stations, each one connected to a central containment unit by a web of tubes and cables. And at the center of it all, suspended in a containment field that glowed faintly blue, was Queen Salith Aeon. She was smaller than I expected. The Velantheri were not a large species, and the containment field made her look even more fragile. She was conscious, her dark eyes open and aware, but I could see the weakness in her. The tubes connected to the containment unit were drawing from her, siphoning her pheromone compounds in a slow, steady extraction that was keeping her alive, but draining her at the same time. I stepped forward, and her eyes found me. Her translator was still active, hanging from a thin chain around her neck, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She said she knew what I was, a human. She asked me how I had come here, because the council had voted. Her own council, the representatives of 400 species, had voted to abandon her. They had declared her lost. They had moved on. I told her the council did not send us. Nobody sent us. We came on our own. She stared at me, and I watched something move through her expression that I had never seen on a Velanthari face before. I think it was surprise, but deeper than that. It was the surprise of someone who had been certain they were going to die and suddenly was not certain anymore. She asked me why. I could have talked about the Accords. I could have talked about the political consequences of her death, the wars that would follow, the billions of lives at stake. All of it was true. All of it mattered. But standing there in that cold room, looking at someone who had been stolen from her home and locked in a cage and slowly drained of everything that made her who she was. I told her because she needed help. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me my name. I told her, and she said it back to me, slowly, carefully, as if she was memorizing it. Leo and Cole moved to the containment unit. The technology was Urathi, unfamiliar, but the principles were universal. Energy source, emitter array, containment matrix. Leo traced the power flow, while Cole identified the control systems. Priya stood ready with her medical kit, preparing for whatever condition the Queen would be in when the field dropped. It took 90 seconds. Leo killed the power feed. Cole overrode the emitter safeties. The containment field flickered once, twice, and then collapsed. The Queen sagged. Priya caught her, easing her down, already checking vitals with a scanner that was not calibrated for Velanthari biology, but was close enough. The Queen was alive. Weak, dehydrated, her pheromone production at dangerously low levels, but alive. And then the alarm sounded. It was not subtle. Every light in the research wing turned red. A deep, pulsing tone echoed through the corridors, the kind of sound designed to carry through an entire station. The containment unit had been rigged with a silent alert tied to its power supply. The moment Leo cut the feed, the station knew. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps above us, many of them moving fast. The Urathi security response was deploying, and they were coming our way. Cole checked his weapon and looked at me. His face was calm, the way it always was when things went wrong. He had been in enough bad situations to know that panic was a luxury they could not afford. I looked at my team, 5 of us, 4 humans and a Thesari, deep inside an enemy fortress, inside an unnavigable nebula, with no backup, no extraction plan, no authorization, and every Urathi soldier on the station heading for our position. I took a breath and told them that the hard part was starting now. Priya had the Queen's arm over her shoulder, half carrying, half guiding her toward the bulkhead we had entered through. Leo took point, his cutting torch swapped for a pulse pistol he had pulled from his kit. Cole fell in behind me, walking backward, his weapon covering our rear. Vieth stayed close to Priya, clutching her comm equipment like a lifeline. We moved fast. The alarm was still screaming, and I could hear the Urathi security teams mobilizing above us. Their boots on the deck plating sounded like drums, heavy and rhythmic, and getting closer. The first squad found us at the junction below the research wing. 4 Urathi soldiers came around the corner at a run, their pulse rifles up, and the corridor lit up with weapons fire. Leo dove left, I dove right. The wall behind where I had been standing vaporized into a cloud of superheated metal. Cole did not dive. Cole stepped into the center of the corridor and fired 3 shots so fast they sounded like one. 2 Urathi went down. The other 2 took cover behind a structural support column, and Cole put a suppressive burst into the column that shattered its facing and drove them back. Leo popped up from behind a conduit housing and dropped the 3rd soldier with a clean shot. The 4th broke and ran, which was smart, because Cole's next burst punched through the column and destroyed the wall panel behind it. We kept moving. The corridors of the maintenance level were a maze, and that was our advantage. The Urathi were bigger than us, faster in a straight line, and they knew their station. But the maintenance passages were tight, cramped, designed for technicians and repair drones, not combat operations. The Urathi soldiers had to duck through hatches and squeeze past pipe clusters. We did not. The Queen could barely walk. Her legs kept giving out, and Priya was carrying more of her weight with every step. I dropped back and took the Queen's other arm, and together Priya and I moved her through the corridors while Leo and Cole held the intersections. She watched us fight for her. I could feel her eyes on me every time I raised my weapon, every time Cole detonated one of his improvised charges to collapse a corridor behind us, every time Leo hot-wired a bulkhead to seal it in the Urathi's faces. She watched all of it with an expression that I could not read, something between disbelief and an emotion that her species did not have a word for. At one point, a Urathi soldier came around a corner directly in front of us. So close, I could have reached out and touched him. He was massive, armored, and his weapon was already rising. I did not have time to aim. I did not have time to think. My body reacted before my brain gave it permission, and I put him down with a shot that I could not have made deliberately in 100 tries. The Queen flinched against me, and then she looked at the fallen soldier, and then she looked at me, and something shifted in her expression. She said one word. Her translator rendered it as remarkable, but I think in her language it meant something closer to terrifying. We reached the central utility shaft, a vertical passage that ran from the maintenance levels down to the docking ring where we had entered. It was a straight drop, 5 levels, with service ladders and cargo lift rails. Leo was already at the shaft door, working the access panel. Behind us, the Urathi were getting organized. The random patrols had become coordinated squads, communicating on encrypted channels, moving in patterns designed to cut off our escape routes. They were good. They were disciplined. They were not used to losing. But they were not used to fighting humans either. Vyeth saved us then. She had been monitoring their frequencies throughout the retreat, and she suddenly grabbed my arm and told me she could hear their deployment orders. The garrison commander was routing 12 squads to converge on the central utility shaft. He was sealing the docking ring. He was cutting off every exit. I asked her if she could do something about it. She stared at me. Her feathers were flat against her skull, her hands were shaking, and her eyes were wide with the kind of fear that makes most people freeze. But she did not freeze. She pulled up her comm unit and started working. Vyeth had spent years studying Irathi communication protocols. She knew their command structure, their encryption methods, their signal formatting. She could not break their encryption in real time, but she could do something almost as effective. She could forge a signal. She built a fake command transmission in 45 seconds. It was not perfect, she told me. A senior communications officer would catch the discrepancies within minutes. But the soldiers in the corridors were not senior communications officers. They were grunts responding to orders. And the order Vyeth broadcast told 6 of the 12 converging squads that intruders had been detected in the reactor section on the far side of the station. Half the garrison changed direction. I watched the motion signatures on Leo's borrowed scanner shift away from our position, 6 squads peeling off toward a threat that did not exist. Vyeth had bought us minutes, maybe 5, maybe fewer, but in a fight like this, minutes were everything. Leo got the shaft door open, and we started down. The Queen could not climb, so I carried her. She weighed almost nothing, and I felt her grip tighten on my shoulder as I descended the ladder with one hand, and I told her I would not drop her. She said she knew. We were 2 levels from the docking ring when the Irathi figured out Vyeth's trick. The comm channels erupted with furious chatter, and the 6 redirected squads reversed course and came back angry. The garrison commander started issuing orders on a channel Vyeth could not spoof, and the net around us began to tighten again. Cole stopped at a landing between levels and looked at me. He said he needed 30 seconds. I did not ask what for. I took the Queen and kept moving. Behind me, I heard Cole working. Then I heard an explosion. Then I heard the sound of metal tearing, and the groan of structural supports failing. Cole had rigged the landing structural joints with shaped charges, and when they blew, the section of shaft above us collapsed inward, sealing the passage with tons of twisted metal and debris. Nothing was coming through that. Not quickly. Cole caught up to us on the docking level, bleeding from a cut above his eye, where a piece of shrapnel had caught him. Priya reached for his face and he waved her off. He told her to save it for someone who needed it. The docking ring was a curved corridor that wrapped around the station's lower hull, connecting the various bays and ports used for supply ships and maintenance vehicles. Our entry point, the waste disposal port, was 300 meters to the right, but between us and the port, I could see movement on Leo's scanner. 2 more squads, positioned at the intersections, waiting. And then Kaya's voice came through the comm. She had been listening to everything. She had heard the alarm, heard the firefight, heard Vyeth's trick, and Cole's demolition. And she had not been idle. While we fought through the station, Kaya had undocked the Jericho Fall from the debris field and moved her to the docking ring's exterior. She told me she was at Bay 7, which was 90 meters to our left, in the opposite direction from the waiting squads. I changed course immediately. We moved left, fast, through a section of the docking ring that the Irathi had not yet covered. Leo went first, clearing corners with quick, efficient movements. Cole covered our rear. Priya took over carrying the Queen, and I dropped back to help Cole hold the corridor. We reached Bay 7 and found something I did not expect. The bay's interior door was sealed, and through the viewport I could see the Jericho Fall docked on the other side. But I could also see Irathi soldiers in the bay itself, a team of 4 who had discovered the ship and were attempting to cut through her airlock. Kaya's voice came through again, calm as still water. She told me she had locked them out, but they were making progress. She estimated 3 minutes before they breached the outer lock. Leo went to work on the interior door. Cole and I held the corridor. The first Irathi squad found us 90 seconds later, and the next 2 minutes were the worst fighting of the entire mission. They came from both ends of the corridor simultaneously, a coordinated assault that used the curved walls of the docking ring to provide cover at every angle. Cole and I fought back to back, literally, our shoulders pressed together, firing down the corridor in opposite directions. I could feel Cole's heartbeat through his back. It was steady, mine was not. But my hands were, and that was what counted. The Urathi were not stupid. They used suppressive fire to pin us down, then advanced in pairs, one shooting while the other moved. They were trained, coordinated, and relentless. Their pulse rounds chewed up the walls around us, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burned metal. The corridor was becoming a furnace, each shot superheating the confined space until the air itself felt like it was fighting against us. But they were also fighting in a narrow corridor, against two humans who had been doing this since before the Urathi had ever heard of Earth, and we had one advantage they did not. We did not fight by doctrine. We fought by instinct. Cole anticipated a flanking move before it happened, putting a burst through a ventilation grate that dropped a soldier who had been crawling through the duct to get behind us. I used a fire extinguisher from the wall as an improvised smokescreen, filling the corridor with white chemical fog that blinded the Urathi's optical sensors. In the confusion, I moved forward, found two soldiers stumbling in the fog, and put them down with shots I could not have made if I had stopped to think about them. Behind us, Leo breached the bay door. Priya rushed the Queen through with Vyeth right behind her. Cole and I backed toward the opening, firing as we went, and I felt the heat of a pulse round pass so close to my head that it singed my hair. We got through. Leo sealed the door behind us and fried the control panel with a pulse from his cutting torch. The four Urathi soldiers who had been working on the Jericho Falls airlock turned when they heard us. Kaya solved that problem. She had routed the ship's docking thrusters to fire a microburst through the bay, and the jet of superheated exhaust sent all four soldiers tumbling across the deck and slammed them into the far wall. We ran for the airlock. Priya went first with the Queen. Vyeth followed. Cole and Leo went next. I went last, and as I crossed the threshold I heard the interior door we had sealed begin to glow red. They were cutting through. Kaya had the engines hot before I even reached the cockpit. The docking clamps released, and the Jericho Fall kicked free of Bay 7 with a surge that pressed me into the nearest bulkhead. Through the viewport, I saw the station falling away behind us, and beyond it, the lights of the Urathi warfleet beginning to move. They knew we had her. Every ship in the formation was coming alive, engines flaring, weapons charging, 18 warships against one battered frigate with a crippled sensor array and a hull that was held together by emergency patches and determination. Kaya did not hesitate. She aimed the Jericho Fall at the Ashen Maw's shear zones and punched the engines to full power. And then Leo's voice came through the intercom from the aft compartment, and what he said stopped my heart. He was not on the ship. I spun around. Priya was in the medical bay with the Queen. Vyeth was strapped into the comm station. Cole was in the weapons bay. But Leo's intercom signal was coming from the station. He had not made it through the airlock. I screamed at Kaya to go back. She did not. She kept flying, and her voice when she spoke was the flattest, steadiest thing I had ever heard. She told me Leo had not missed the airlock. He had chosen not to board. Leo's voice came through one more time. He was at the choke point, the corridor junction outside Bay 7. The Urathi had breached the interior door, and he was holding them there, alone. With the weapons he had, and the position he had chosen, and the knowledge that every second he held that corridor was a second more that the Jericho Fall had to get clear. I told him to fall back. I told him to find another way to the docking ring. I told him we would come back for him. He told me to get the Queen home. He said that was the mission. He said he would be fine, and I knew he was lying, and he knew I knew, and neither of us said anything else about it. The last thing I heard before we passed out of comm range was the sound of Leo's weapon firing. Steady, measured, controlled. He was holding the line. Priya was beside me. She had heard everything. She did not speak. She put her hand on my arm and held on, and I felt the pressure of her grip like an anchor in a storm. Kaya flew. Behind us, the Urathi fleet gave chase. Ahead of us, the Ashen Maw waited with its shear zones and its gravity corridors and its physics that said we should already be dead. Kaya looked at me with blood running from a cut above her left eye and bruises on her hands from the manual controls, and an expression that was not confidence or courage, but something harder than both. She told me we would make it. I looked at her. I looked at the hell we were about to fly back through, with a crippled ship and enemy fighters on our tail, and the Queen dying in the medical bay. I told her we always did. The Ashen Maw hit us like a fist. The moment we crossed the boundary, the gravitational forces seized the Jericho Fall and tried to tear her apart. The hull screamed. Every warning light on the console went red. The ship twisted sideways, caught in a shear zone that Kaya had dodged on the way in, but that had shifted position in the hours since. She corrected. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but with a raw, desperate wrench of the controls that slammed the ship through the shear zone's edge and out the other side. The port stabilizer cracked. I heard it go, a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the hull like a broken bone. Behind us, the Urathi fighters entered the Ashen Maw. I counted 6 on the aft sensors before the interference swallowed the display. 6 fighters, faster and more maneuverable than the Jericho Fall, crewed by pilots who were angry and determined and had every reason to stop us from reaching open space. But they were flying with computers. The first one died 11 seconds into the nebula. It followed Kaya through a gravity corridor that twisted like a corkscrew, and its navigational system tried to plot a course through the spiral. The computer found a solution, but the solution was 2 seconds too slow. The corridor shifted, the fighter hit a wall of gravitational force, and it folded like paper. One moment it was there, the next it was a streak of light and debris. The second fighter pulled back, widening its distance. Smart. But Kaya was not making it easy. She flew like nothing I had ever seen before, not even from her. She was not threading corridors anymore. She was dancing with the nebula, feeling its rhythms, anticipating its shifts, turning the Ashen Maw itself into a weapon against our pursuers. 2 more fighters tried to close the gap. Kaya led them through a passage between 2 converging gravity wells, a gap that was closing like a pair of jaws. She timed it perfectly. The Jericho Fall squeezed through with meters to spare. The fighters did not. One was crushed instantly. The other was caught by the edge of the well and flung sideways into a shear zone that ripped off its wing and sent it spinning into the dark. 3 down, 3 still behind us. But the ship was failing. The port stabilizer was gone. The forward sensor array was reporting ghost readings. The hull integrity warnings were stacking up faster than Cole could clear them, and we were losing atmosphere from at least 2 micro-breaches in the lower deck. In the medical bay, Priya was fighting her own battle. The Queen was dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a candle burning down. Her pheromone production had dropped to almost nothing. The extraction process on the station had damaged her glands, and without the pheromones, her body was shutting down. Priya's medical scanners were not calibrated for Velanthari biology, but she did not need perfect readings to see what was happening. The numbers were falling, all of them, and they were not going to stop. Priya tried everything she had: stimulants, stabilizers, compounds designed for human biology that she adjusted on the fly based on what little she knew about Velanthari physiology. Some of them helped briefly. Most did nothing. The Queen's eyes were still open, still aware, but the light in them was fading. Then Priya had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, and I have never been able to decide which. The Queen's pheromone glands were not destroyed. They were depleted, drained, shut down by exhaustion and trauma. They needed a trigger, a chemical shock strong enough to restart the production cycle. Priya did not have Velanthari pharmaceuticals. She did not have alien biochemistry databases or specialized equipment, or any of the things that a proper medical team would have brought. She had human adrenaline. Not synthetic. Hers. She drew her own blood, isolated the epinephrine compounds using her field kit centrifuge, and prepared a direct injection. The theory, if you could call it that, was that the adrenaline would act as a systemic stimulant, shocking the Queen's metabolism into emergency production mode the same way a defibrillator shocks a stopped heart. It should not have worked. The biochemistry was wrong. The dosage calculations were guesswork. The entire approach violated about 30 protocols that Priya could name off the top of her head. She told the Queen what she was going to do. The Queen looked at her for a long moment, then closed her eyes and nodded. Priya made the injection. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Queen's body seized, every muscle contracting at once, and Priya grabbed her and held her down and counted heartbeats and prayed to whatever she prayed to. The seizure lasted 8 seconds. Then it stopped, and the Queen gasped, a deep, shuddering breath that sounded like someone breaking the surface after too long underwater. Priya checked her scanner. The pheromone glands were firing. Weakly, erratically, but firing. Production was climbing. The numbers were going up. Priya sat back on her heels and let out a breath that she had been holding for what felt like an hour. She looked at the Queen with an expression that was half relief and half amazement. She told me later that she had given the injection a 20% chance of working, which was better odds than anything else on this mission. She had gambled on the one thing she understood better than alien biology, human chemistry, and it had paid off. The Queen's eyes were clearer now, more focused, and her breathing had steadied into a rhythm that Priya recognized as recovery. She got back to work, stabilizing the Queen's vitals, monitoring the pheromone output, doing everything she could to keep that fragile recovery going. In the cockpit, the situation was getting worse. The 3 remaining Yarathi fighters had learned from their dead companions. They were hanging back, using long-range fire to harass us without entering the most dangerous corridors. Their shots were not accurate. The nebula's interference made precision targeting impossible, but they did not need precision. They just needed luck, and luck is a numbers game. A pulse round clipped our starboard engine housing. The impact was not critical, but it added another crack to a ship that was already falling apart. Cole was in the weapons bay, trying to return fire, but the Jericho Falls weapon systems were designed for broadside engagements, not rearguard actions against nimble fighters in a debris field. He hit one. A lucky shot that caught a fighter as it banked through a gravity well, punching through its canopy and sending it tumbling. The pilot ejected, and I watched the escape pod disappear into the nebula. 2 left. The final shear zone was ahead of us. It was the boundary of the Ashen Maw, the last barrier between the nebula's interior and open space. On the way in, it had been the most dangerous part of the transit. Now, with a crippled ship and 2 fighters still on our tail, it looked like a wall. Kaya studied the readings. What was left of our sensors showed the shear zone in fragments, partial data, incomplete models, gaps where the instruments simply could not keep up with the shifting forces. She was going to have to fly the last stretch entirely on instinct. She told me to strap in. Then she told everyone to strap in. Then she pushed the throttle forward and aimed the Jericho Fall at the narrowest point in the shear zone, a gap that was maybe 3 times our width and closing. The 2 remaining fighters followed. They were committed now, too close to pull back, riding our wake through the gravitational chaos. Kaya hit the gap at full speed. The ship bucked and twisted. Metal groaned. Something in the port engine assembly tore loose with a sound like a scream, and the entire port engine died. We were flying on one engine through a gravitational corridor that was trying to crush us flat. Cole's voice came from the weapons bay. He told me the port engine was gone. I told him I knew. The ship was shaking apart around us. I could hear rivets popping somewhere in the lower deck, a series of sharp pings that sounded like a countdown. The emergency bulkheads in the aft section had sealed automatically, which meant we had lost pressure back there. Warning alarms competed with each other, overlapping into a wall of noise that made it impossible to think. I silenced them all. Every alarm, every warning, every flashing light. The sudden quiet was almost worse. Kaya compensated. She redirected everything we had to the starboard engine and used the gravitational currents themselves to maintain our trajectory, riding the forces that should have been destroying us, the way a surfer rides a riptide. It was impossible. Every calculation said so. Every computer model would have called it a fatal error. Kaya did not care about calculations. The 2 fighters behind us hit the same shear zone and paid for it. One lost its port stabilizer and spun out, its computer unable to correct fast enough. The pilot fought it for 2 seconds before the gravitational forces took the ship apart piece by piece. The other fighter pulled up hard, choosing retreat over destruction, and disappeared back into the nebula. We were alone. Damaged, limping, bleeding atmosphere from half a dozen breaches, running on one engine and prayers. But alone. Cole was not in the weapons bay anymore. He was in the port engine compartment, which had lost its atmosphere when the engine housing cracked. He was working in vacuum, no oxygen, his suit's emergency supply giving him maybe 4 minutes. He was rerouting the power conduits from the dead port engine to the starboard system, a job that normally required a full engineering team and a dry dock. He did it in 3 minutes and 11 seconds. The starboard engine surged as the additional power hit it, and the Jericho Fall lurched forward with a burst of speed that carried us through the final meters of the shear zone. Cole's oxygen ran out 9 seconds before Leo, who was back in the pressurized section, got the emergency hatch open and pulled him through. Cole was unconscious, his face blue, his lungs empty. Priya left the Queen long enough to get an oxygen mask on him and restart his breathing. He coughed, gasped, and said something that I think was a joke, but that nobody could hear over the sound of the ship falling apart around us. Then we were out. The ashen maw fell away behind us like a nightmare fading in morning light, and the stars of open space filled the viewport, clear and steady and impossibly beautiful after hours of chaos and darkness. And we were not alone. The Union fleet was there, all of it. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species, arrayed across the sector in a formation that I recognized as a diplomatic assembly, the kind of fleet gathering that happened when the galaxy was preparing for a political transition. They had come not to rescue us, not to fight the Urathi, but to witness the end of the Accords. They were waiting for the Queen to die so they could begin the grim business of managing what came after. The Jericho Fall tumbled out of the ashen maw like a wounded bird, trailing debris and atmosphere, one engine firing, the other dark. We must have looked like a ghost ship, a wreck that had no business still being in one piece. Then the Queen's biosignature bloomed across every sensor in the fleet. It started small, a faint pulse that the nearest ships barely registered. But it grew. Priya's adrenaline trick had worked better than anyone could have predicted, and the Queen's pheromone glands were ramping up, producing at a rate that exceeded her normal output. The Accord resonance pulsed outward from our tiny, broken ship like a heartbeat, washing over the assembled fleet, reaching into every vessel, every species, every individual within range. I felt it, even humans, who were supposedly immune to the resonance's biological effects, felt something. A calm, a settling, like the moment after a storm passes and the air goes still. Across the fleet, weapons that had been quietly charging went cold. Shields that had been raised in anticipation of interspecies conflict dropped. Species that had been eyeing each other with ancient suspicion turned their attention to the battered frigate tumbling out of an impossible nebula with a cargo that everyone had given up for dead. Every comm channel in the sector went silent. Every ship, every species, every voice. The silence lasted 10 seconds, and it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I keyed the comm. My voice was hoarse, and my hands were shaking, and I was bleeding from a cut I did not remember getting, and I sent one message to the Union Chancellor. I told him that reckless humans were returning with his Queen, and I requested medical teams on standby. The Chancellor's voice came back after a long pause. He sounded like a man who was watching something he had believed was impossible happen right in front of him. He asked me to confirm the Queen's status. I told him she was alive, her pheromone production was active, and she needed immediate medical attention. I also told him we had intel on a Urathi weapons program that the Council needed to hear about immediately. Then I cut the channel, because I did not trust myself to say anything else without my voice breaking. The response was immediate. 3 medical frigates broke formation and converged on our position. Docking tubes extended. Trauma teams boarded. The Queen was transferred to a proper medical facility within minutes, surrounded by doctors and specialists from a dozen species who had the equipment and the knowledge to treat her properly. Priya watched them take over and did not say a word. She just sat down on the deck of the medical bay she had built from a storage closet, with her hands covered in alien blood and human blood and chemical compounds she had mixed from memory, and she closed her eyes. We learned about Leo 16 hours later. The Union, galvanized by the proof that the Ashen Maw was navigable, had sent a strike force into the nebula. The Urathi garrison, already in chaos after our escape, was overwhelmed within hours. The bio-research wing was seized, the synthetic pheromone project was destroyed, and the station's crew was taken into custody. Leo was found in the corridor outside Bay 7. He had held that choke point for 23 minutes against a force that outnumbered him by more than he ever should have been able to hold. He had barricaded the corridor using debris from the bulkhead, creating a makeshift fighting position that forced the Urathi to approach single file. He had used every weapon he carried, then used tools from his engineering kit, then used pieces of the corridor itself. When they found him, his pulse pistol was empty, his cutting torch was burned out, and he was sitting with his back against the barricade with a pipe wrench in his hand and a look on his face that the Union soldiers described as calm. He was wounded, 3 pulse burns on his legs, a fractured rib, and a concussion that the doctors said should have put him unconscious an hour before they found him. But he was breathing. When they brought him aboard the medical frigate, the Drenari doctor who examined him said something in his own language that his translator rendered as, "This one refused to be finished." I think it lost something in translation, but the meaning was clear. The Queen addressed the full Union Council 3 days later. She stood at the center of the great chamber, still thin, still bearing the marks of her captivity, but upright and steady, and radiating a quiet power that filled the room. She told them what had happened. Not the political summary, not the diplomatic version, the truth. She told them that 400 species with vast fleets and immeasurable resources had looked at the math and decided she was not worth saving. She told them that the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy had weighed her life against the risk, and found the risk too heavy. She told them that every admiral, every ambassador, every chancellor in the room had made the rational decision. And then she told them about 5 humans with a broken ship. She told them about Kaya, who flew through physics that computers said were impossible, using nothing but her hands and her instincts, and her refusal to believe that the word impossible meant anything at all. She told them about Cole, who turned maintenance equipment into weapons and sealed his own escape route to buy his crew 10 more seconds. She told them about Priya, who saved an alien queen's life with a syringe of her own blood, and a theory she invented on the spot. She told them about Leo, who stayed behind in a corridor full of enemies so that his friends could reach the ship. And she told them about me, though I wished she had not. She told them I had looked at a dying queen in a cage, and told her I came because she needed help. She said that in all her years of ruling, in all the councils and summits and negotiations she had conducted with hundreds of species, no one had ever given her an answer that simple, or that true. She paused then, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that silenced even the translators. She told the council that while she was in that containment cell, she had accepted her death. She had made peace with it. She had not expected rescue because the numbers did not support it. And the Union was built on numbers, probabilities, calculations, risk assessments, cost-benefit analyses. The Union's strength had always been its rationality. But rationality, she said, had left her to die, and irrationality had saved her. Then she addressed the word they used for humans: reckless. It was the word the Union had chosen when they first encountered us. The word that appeared in diplomatic assessments and military analyses and cultural studies. Reckless. It implied carelessness, irresponsibility, a failure to properly calculate consequences. She told them the word was wrong. The correct word, she said, was brave. And the difference between reckless and brave was not about odds or calculations. It was about why you moved. Reckless was jumping without looking. Brave was jumping because you looked and saw someone falling and decided that catching them mattered more than the height. The chamber was silent. 400 species, 1,000 delegates, the collected leadership of a galactic civilization. Not one of them spoke. I was not in the chamber for that speech. I heard about it later, from Vyeth, who had been given a seat in the Thessari delegation's gallery. She told me that when the Queen finished speaking, the Korvathi delegate, the same one who had given me the data chip, stood up and clicked his mandibles in the pattern that his species used to express a concept that translated roughly as, "I was wrong, and I understand why." Then the Drenari delegate stood, then the Thessari ambassador. One by one, the delegations rose, not applauding because most of them did not clap, but acknowledging, in whatever way their biology allowed, that something had changed. The Morvathi chancellor, the same one who had refused to authorize our mission, remained seated the longest. When he finally stood, he did so slowly, deliberately, and he looked directly at the gallery where the human delegation sat. His expression was unreadable, but his gesture was not. He placed both hands over his chest, which in Morvathi culture was the deepest form of concession. It meant not just that he was wrong, but that he was grateful to have been wrong. I visited the Queen during her recovery. She was in a medical suite aboard the Union's Central Station, surrounded by technology and specialists, and the full weight of galactic civilization's best care. She looked better, stronger. The light was back in her eyes. She asked me why I came. Again. The same question she had asked in the containment cell. I told her the same thing, but I said more of it this time. I told her it was not about the Accords, though the Accords mattered. It was not about politics, though the politics were real. It was because leaving someone to suffer when you had the ability to try to help was something that humans could not do. Not would not, could not. It was built into us, the same way her pheromones were built into her. We did not choose it any more than she chose to produce the compounds that held the galaxy together. It was simply what we were. She studied me for a long time. Then she said something that stayed with me long after I left that room, long after the political aftermath settled, and the Urathi were sanctioned, and the Ashen Maw was mapped and declared navigable, and the Union began the slow process of reckoning with its own failure. She said that perhaps the galaxy needed more recklessness. I walked back to the docking bay, where the Jericho Fall sat in a repair cradle, looking even worse than she had when we pulled her out of salvage. Her hull was scarred and cracked. Her port engine was gone. Her sensor array was a tangle of fused circuitry, and there was a scorch mark on her bow, where a pulse round had come close enough to leave a permanent reminder. The repair crews had wanted to scrap her. I had told them no. She had earned better than that. My crew was there. Kaya was in the cockpit, running diagnostics on systems that were mostly broken, making lists of things that needed fixing. Cole was in the weapons bay, rebuilding the torpedo launchers from components he had salvaged from somewhere I did not want to ask about. Priya was restocking the medical bay, which she had decided was a permanent feature of the ship now, not a temporary conversion. Leo was sitting on the deck with his back against the main power conduit, his arm in a sling, and a bruise on his face that covered most of his left cheek, and he was arguing with Cole about whether the starboard thruster alignment was 3 degrees off or 4. Vyeth was there too. She was sitting in the comm station chair, her feathers smoothed and calm for the first time since I had met her, reading through Urathi communication intercepts that the Union Intelligence Service had recovered from the station. She looked up when I came in and gave me a small nod, and I realized that she was not visiting, she was staying. I stood in the airlock and looked at them, these people who had followed me into a collapsing nebula and a fortified enemy station, and a fight that every rational analysis said they could not win. They had done it without orders, without authorization, without any guarantee that they would come home. They had done it because someone needed help, and they were the kind of people who could not hear that and do nothing. The Korvathi had given us a 0.07% chance of survival. I thought about that number. I thought about what it meant, and what it did not mean. It did not mean we were lucky. It meant the Korvathi did not have a variable in their equations for the thing that made humans different. They could calculate thrust and mass and gravitational force. They could model probability and risk and resource allocation. But they could not calculate the moment when a pilot shuts off her computer and flies by feel. They could not model the decision to stay behind in a corridor so your friends can escape. They could not quantify the act of drawing your own blood to save a stranger. The aliens called us reckless because they did not have a better word. The Queen had given them one. Brave. But even that was not quite right. The truth was simpler and stranger, and harder to explain than any single word could capture. We were human, and humans do not leave people behind. I walked into the ship and closed the airlock behind me, and Kaya asked me where we were going next, and Leo said anywhere with a decent repair dock, and Cole said anywhere with better food, and Priya said anywhere that was not inside a collapsing nebula, and I sat down in the commander's chair and felt the hum of the Jericho Falls one working engine through the deck plating, and I smiled. The galaxy was big and old and full of species that had been doing this for thousands of years longer than we had. They had better ships, better weapons, better technology, better math. They had everything except the one thing that mattered most. They had never learned how to be reckless.